Last week we took a look at the Dread King's Legion campaign mechanics, but they also come with a whole roster of unique units. There's Beasts and Balistas and a whole bunch of skeletons, so let's take a look and check them out. But first, thanks to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. Summer is well and truly upon us, and while the sun is hot, there's no better time to spend all of your days locked away inside playing video games. Instant Gaming offers games at low prices than you can find anywhere else. Whether you want to hop onto Pharaoh to check out the new Dynasties DLC, or you're one of the 3 people left on Earth who doesn't own Skyrim, they have you covered with their 24/7 customer service. Check out Instant Gaming at the link below to grab yourself some cheap games, and now, onto the video. Let's kick things off with the Lords, starting with the Dread King himself. He's a powerful frontlines battler, with strong armor, great melee stats, and high non-armor piercing damage. He's great versus less armored enemies or for keeping enemies busy with his long lifespan. He also has access to the Law of the Vampires, so can bring healing, damage, and more from that. All around, he's a strong frontlines casting lord like you'd expect from the undead. For his mounting options, he has the Skeletal Steed. This brings more speed and charge bonus, but does make him a large target. It's a decent upgrade to get him casting wherever you want, just be more careful when fighting, as it's now a much larger target. The Skeletal Pegasus comes with even more speed and he can now fly. With this newfound speed, he can cast wherever you want and be there in seconds, as well as attacking whatever you want. Just be more cautious because he's even larger and will go down fast if he can't escape to the skies. And lastly, we have Gorgon. This is his big old dragon. This loses some speed and a bunch of other stats, but gains lots more health and armor piercing damage. He has a huge hitbox, but also huge monstrous unit that can take on tides of infantry with ease. He can still get cast wherever needed and can now help out on the front lines just as easily. Just look out for missile focus or being surrounded with a hitbox that large. The Hand of Nagash is a very high risk, high reward fighter. He has very low armor, moderate melee stats, but magical armor piercing damage. He can do a lot of damage to almost any target, but does so at a huge risk to himself. If you can somehow find a tough target to attack safely, then go right ahead. Otherwise, keep it at the back and casting to ensure your army has a lord. Same Law of the Vampires, so great value all around. For his mounting options, he has the Skeletal Steed and the Chariots of the Hand, which drops melee stats to gain armor, speed, and charge bonus. Of course, this is a charging powerhouse if you can handle the micro, but if you can, it will die the moment you leave it in combat. Theseps is quite similar to the Dread King, but a little weaker across the board. Still does the same sorts of jobs, so decently tough but low damage with very little armor piercing. Now has the Law of the Beast for the best damage in the game from the Amber Spear, and some nice buffs and summons. Keep him fighting on the front lines, mostly for presence and leadership, and get casts off wherever needed. Basimius is exactly the same as Theseps, but now has the Law of the Shadows, so much more damage, and some great buffs and hexes. Can be used exactly the same otherwise. And lastly, we have our one and only generic lord, the Leech Strategos, and these can come with the Law of Death or Vampires. These are very much casting only lords. They're relatively tanky with strong armor and moderate defense, but their damage is so low that it's hardly worth it against anything that can actually fight. Keep them on the backlines and casting, preferably with the Law of the Vampires, and they should bring you plenty of value. For their mounting options, they have the Skeletal Steed, the Dread Chariot, which similar to all chariots, drops its melee stats to gain speed and charge bonus, and this time a bonus versus infantry. Same story as always, keep them moving and charging to get good damage, and don't let them stop moving unless you want them to die. They also have the Skeletal Pegasus, and the Skeletal Elephants. Obviously, this is much slower than the Pegasus, but gains some massive armor piercing damage alongside a ranged weapons team to deal constant damage whenever nearby to enemies. It's a really strong option to make them powerful on the front lines, as well as by casting, and would be my go-to as soon as it's available. Moving over to the heroes, we have the one and only legendary hero, Gunther Larenchild. He's a very standard casting hero with access to the Law of the Vampires. No real combat expertise to speak of, so keep him well back in casting, and he should do just fine. Really isn't much more to say, since he can't do much else. The Hellwraiths are your battle assassin heroes. They move fast and have moderate melee stats, so are able to close the gaps and engage lords and heroes in moments. Their damage is magical and armor piercing and frostbitten, so they'll hit hard versus anything and are extremely hard to get away from. Lastly, their resistance makes them deceptively tough as long as no magical damage comes their way. They are a little high risk, but if the cards play in your favour, they can be extremely high reward. The Hetairoi are more of a frontlines battler with great armour, decent melee stats, and armour piercing anti-infantry damage. Just throw them into the front lines to battle the baddest infantry the enemy can throw at them, and they'll likely rack up a ton of value. Just keep an eye on their HP, as that low defense can come back to bite them, even with that extremely high armour. For their mounting options, they have the Skeletal Steed, the Dread Chariot, and the Skeletal Pegasus. And lastly, we have our Corrupted Priests, and these come with the Law of Death, Shadows, or Vampires. Very straightforward spellcasters, no real melee prowess or toughness, so keep them safe and casting on the back lines rather than risking them in combat. And they come with a Skeletal Steed. Now we get into the actual units. I should mention that the Dread King borrows a lot of units from other undead factions. When we come to one of these units, I'll show their stats compared to the original unit and just move on to the next one. If you'd like to know how to use those units in more detail, you can check out my faction guide to the Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings and everyone else linked in one of the corners right now. So first up, melee infantry, we have Skeleton Warriors, which are of course from the Tomb Kings as well as the Vampire Counts. Same for Skeleton Spearmen, Crypt Ghouls from the Vampire Counts, and the same for Cairn Wraiths. Skeleton hoplites are a significant step up from the spearmen in terms of a sturdy front line. They have moderately high armor and some pretty decent melee stats, especially defense, making them an excellent line holder against all kinds of enemy threats. They also have some nice damage with a bonus versus large, but against most targets, they'll need a lot of help, so send plenty their way to make the most of them holding the line. Lastly, their phalanx ability will make them nearly immovable once they've been stationary for 10 seconds, so set them up and let enemies come to them to try to shift the immovable object. Skeleton pikemen are very similar to hoplites, but drop the shields and some damage in exchange for even more melee defense. As long as they're not being targeted by enemy range, they will hold the line for an exceptionally long time and be totally immovable against all but the largest threats. Again, they will do decent non-armor piercing anti-large damage, but give them as much support as you can, as they really are there to focus on defense instead of being damage dealers. Mummies are a much more offensive focused unit. They may not have the greatest armor or melee stats, but their mere presence on the front lines will bring down enemy power considerably, making them a lot more effective than it might seem. Their Curse of the Mummy imbued attacks will bring down the damage and vigor of enemy units considerably, taking most of the wind out of enemy damage dealers' sails in moments. Their anti-infantry damage will then allow them to cut through most medium armored foes with ease. Whilst they may struggle against tougher high armor targets, for a brief period in the mid-game, they'll be a terror, especially against the mostly Tomb Kings you'll be battling during the campaign. Royal Guards are now getting to the endgame front lines of the Legion. Coming from Mummies, everything is seeing improvements with high armor, a silver shield, decent melee stats, and even some okay anti-infantry damage. That said, they are primarily a defensive unit. That damage won't really be felt by most armoured later game troops, so they'll need to rely on assistance from other units to get the job done. Against most targets, they'll hold the line for a very long time with a stats card like this, so just make sure you set them up and bring in the big guns once the lines clash to make their hard work pay off. And lastly, the Great Weapons Royal Guard. These drop some defense in exchange for a lot more armor piercing damage. The attack sees no change, so they'll quite literally still be a bit hit and miss, but when they hit, the damage will be felt no matter how tough the armor is. Their weapon strength is heavily armor piercing, and the bonus versus infantry will only make this better, making them devastating when battling enemy infantry units. The downside of all this extra damage is their low defense and lack of shields, making them a lot more vulnerable to all forms of enemy damage. You'll still need to give them plenty of support to take down enemies fast, so it all really comes down to which playstyle you prefer, slow and steady or constant aggression. Moving over to the ranged infantry, first up we have skeleton archers from the Tomb Kings, then skeleton javelinmen. These drop some range and ammo in exchange for nearly double the damage and a bonus versus large. This makes them a lot riskier to use, but if you're targeting large to make the most of the extra damage, it hardly matters. Getting them up close to your front lines and focusing down large targets on the enemy side should allow them to rack up easy value whilst keeping themselves safe. Just be cautious about enemy units breaking through your ranks and taking them on in melee, as their combat stats are just about useless. If there's no large targets or cav, then try to get them flanking to get shots onto the front lines. Just be aware of how short that range is, so they don't get caught out and pulled into melee. Lastly, we have the Royal Peltasts. These are a cross between the Javelin Men and the Hoplites from the melee infantry. They're a little worse across the board melee-wise, but are still respectable with high defense and some decent attack and damage, as well as that extremely high armor. The range damage does see some nice improvements, with even more damage and a little more range. The damage both in melee and from a range is anti-large, but not overly armor piercing, so less armored big boys will be their prime target no matter what. Use them similarly to the Javelin Men and use as much ammo as possible before sending them into melee. Whilst they can do okay, it's much safer to let them fire everything first before sending them in to take some hits of their own. Moving over to the Cavalry and Chariots, we have the Skeleton Horsemen from the Tomb Kings, and the same for the Skeleton Chariots. The Royal Guard Cavalry are very much a direct upgrade to the Skeleton Horsemen. They keep the same moderately high speed but gain improvements to every stat but charge bonus. This makes them into great sustained combat cav with decent melee stats and strong anti-infantry damage. They'll excel at taking out enemy infantry or artillery teams before coming back to charge into the backs of the front lines to finish them off for good. Against proper frontlines units, they may struggle in sustained combat even with their stats and armor, so feel free to cycle charge for some decent damage whilst keeping them a lot safer. Overall, they're a really great cav unit that you can't really go wrong with as long as you just use them. The Royal Guard Lancers drop some defense for a massive boost to charge bonus. This of course transforms them into shock cavalry, making cycle charging a must, especially against units that can fight in melee. Against backlines, they'll still get away with sustained combat, but when taking on front lines, cycling will be a must to keep them safe with that massive drop in defense. If you want to optimize their damage, then charging them at all times is the way to go. 75 charge bonus is huge, and against basically anything, they will deal devastating damage with each and every impact. And lastly, we have the Hex Wraiths from the Vampire Counts. For the Missile Cavalry and Chariots, we have these Skeleton Horse Archers from the Tomb Kings, and the same with these Skeleton Archer Chariots. For the Monsters and Beasts, we have the Fellbats from the Vampire Counts, and the same with the Direwolves. Skeletal Minotaurs compare pretty well to regular Minotaurs, all with a lot less leadership and some extra charge bonus. They can still be used pretty much the same, and that's to do, basically, anything you want. With speed like that, they can charge around the map, taking on whatever you want. If you want them to rip backlines ranged units to shreds, they can. If you want them chasing down enemy camp before they can get value, they can. If you just want them beefing up your front lines and wiping out melee infantry with their massive damage, then they can do that too. The bottom line with them is the same as most Minotaurs. The only wrong way to use them is to not use them at all. Skeletal elephants are very similar to the mounts for the Liege Strategos Lords. They have extremely strong melee power with decent stats and armor piercing damage in an area. They're decently tough but not indestructible, especially with their reduced armor, and that range damage on their back will bring extra value all battle long, even if it's not the most armor piercing. Getting them on your front lines and fighting at all times and keeping out for them being surrounded or focused from ranged. As long as neither of these happen to them, they should do some great work. Bone Colossus is pretty much their version of the Giant, not to be confused with a Bone Giant, which is a different thing entirely. This is very much in the same vein as regular giants, so that means a big ol' hitbox and slower speed, making it a dream for ranged units and a miracle if it gets the front lines alive. If it does make it into melee, it can do some great work with very high melee attack and exceptionally high armor piercing damage, making it a shredder of all types of armored infantry. It's also decently tough with moderate defense and high armor, as well as that massive HP pool. As long as it doesn't get immediately wiped out by ranged units, it can actually do some really great work. So clear the area for its approach, and it should be fine. And lastly, the Bone Hydra. Would you believe me if I told you this is more or less the same as the Dark Elves Hydra, but with a little less leadership? Well, it is, and that's not really a bad thing. It's still a great frontlines monster with great attack and damage, allowing it to tear through infantry with ease, no matter how tough they are. It comes with a breath ability for more damage and tons of regeneration, making it exceptionally hard to get rid of. It's not quite as easy a target for enemy ranged as the Giant, thanks to a shorter hitbox and high speed, but still try not to let it get too heavily focused and you should have a good time. Just get it into those front lines and watch it go to work. Finally, we come to the artillery and war machines. First up, the bone throwers. These are exactly the same as the bolt throwers from the dwarves, at least in terms of their ranged power. In melee, they're a good deal weaker, but you shouldn't really resort to that in any case, so it hardly matters. They want to set up at the back of your army and fire onto large enemy targets to chip away at their HP with their armor-piercing missiles. Their firing arcs are pretty flat, but against large targets, this shouldn't matter too much. The same as the bolt throwers, they're not going to win you any battles alone, but they'll provide you with some okay missile damage fairly early on, so you can't complain about that. Next up, the Screaming Skull Ballistas. You would think it'd work differently to the Screaming Skull Catapult since it's a ballista and they normally have a different firing arc, but honestly, it's the exact same, if not better. Set it at the back and have it fire onto clusters of infantry, and it'll do just fine. If you need to focus down large targets, then it'll also do that kind of okay. Bottom line is, aim it at something and it'll do good work. And lastly, we have the Mortis Engine from the Vampire Counts. Now we come to the Regiments of Renown. I'll call out each unit, what it's a base unit of, and any differences from the base unit. The Whites of the Twisted Spire are Skeleton Hoplites and swap Failings for White Blade and gain armor sundering attacks. The Cluruchoi of Bagar are a Mummies unit and gain regeneration and the Unyielding ability. The Catacomb Guardians are Royal Guards and gain Failings, Dark Oaths, and Guardian abilities. Reichwald's Brigands are Empire Crossbowmen and gain Vanguard deployment, Stalk, and Expendable. Black Grail Knights are Bretonnian Grail Guardians and cause terror and swap the Blessing of the Lady for the Blessing of the Black Grail. The Oracle of Pythos is a Skeletal Elephant and gains the Balefire ability. The Eternal Bond of Thessos is a Skeleton Hoplites unit and become ethereal and gain the Soul Avenger ability. The Indomitable are Skeleton Hoplites and swap Failings for Deathblow. Phalian Riders are Skeleton Horsemen and gain the Diamond Formation ability. And lastly, the Polybolus is a Bone Thrower. Of course, the Dread King's legions make use of recruitment capacity like the Tomb Kings, so these comps are good templates to follow, but at the end of the day, you just have to work with what you have access to. So, starting in Tier 1, we have the Vampire Liege Strategos. I mean, we have no real choice, but we are going to choose to go with the Lore of the Vampires because it's the best lore by far, both in the game and of the choices we have. Early on, these lords can actually do some decent fighting against weaker threats alongside keeping units healthy with their limited spellbook. For the front lines, we're going to go with 6 Skeleton Spearmen. These are the best defensive line for the early game. An argument could be made for warriors to bring a bit more damage, but I personally think defense is a lot easier to manage and means less replenishment every turn, which is a win when you're trying to build up some momentum. We're going to go with 6 Skeleton Bowmen, and these will be your main damage early on. While their stats may not say a whole lot, in large numbers it adds up, and against most early threats, they'll do a fine job and help get your army over the finish line in no time. And lastly, we're going to go with 3 Skeleton Horsemen and 4 Felbats. These will both work on the same job of backlines harassment. Whilst you'll most likely be fighting Tomb Kings, you'll still want to take down any backlines enemies as quickly as possible to keep your army safe and healthy. Use Felbats for blitz attacks and have Horsemen chase down anything that's left before bringing them back in to overwhelm anything left on the front lines. Coming into Tier 2, our lords should have a few more spells and a mount by now, so be casting wherever needed and doing a lot less direct battling since their damage doesn't exactly scale well, at least not yet. I'm going to pick up a Heteroi hero, and I think this is one of the first times I've recommended a purely battling hero, but this faction kinda needs it. I'm going to use this guy to focus enemy lords and heroes with their high armor piercing damage, as well as any other elite threats the rest of the army will struggle to deal with. For the front lines, we're going to go with 6 Royal Guards, and we have reached our end game front lines units. These are purely defense focused, so it's the easiest option to manage, and we'll have plenty of other damage, so they'll get on just fine. We're going to go with 6 Skeleton Javelin Men, drop in some range to get boosted damage. The Royal Guard should hold the line well enough to keep these guys safe, so just focus on picking out key targets for them to focus and keeping an eye out for flankers. We're going to grab 4 Direwolves, and these are inheriting the flanking job, so we'll be focused on enemy ranged units. They can't really kill much else other than anything retreating, so keep them on enemy backlines at all times. And lastly, we're going to take 2 Screaming Skull Ballistas. This will bring some more damage to the front lines with their explosive missiles, and they can do well versus anything, so thin the front lines horde first before turning their attention to whatever needs killing. And lastly, for tier 3, our lords should be in their final form on an elephant's mount, and they can finally rejoin the front lines and deal some decent damage alongside their spellcasting. Just be careful of that large hitbox, as I was not in this battle, as you will see. The Hetero should now be on a flying mount and can now get anywhere and fight anything. Still, use them to take on lords and heroes and other single entities in your army you may struggle with. They're a little large now, so just make sure they don't get bogged down, focused, and you should be fine. We're going to keep the same front line with the 6 Royal Guards, and we're going to pick up 4 Hex Wraiths, and these are going to be our final flanking units. They'll do the same job as the Direwolves, only a little bit better, and can come back to charge the backs of the front lines for some extra damage, but mainly leadership sapping. We're going to pick up 2 Skeletal Elephants and 2 Bone Hydras, and both of these will bring some much needed power to the front lines to take out most infantry with ease. Not great versus other large monsters, so do your best to wipe out everything else and trigger army losses as soon as possible. We're going to bring the same number of ballistas as before, but now focus more on taking out larger targets, since not much else in the army can get the job done. Lastly, we're going to close this out with 2 Mortis Engines. They are here to bring lots of auras to the front lines. Combat use is minimal, so just getting close by for healing and all kinds of other buffing and debuffing auras. Now for a few final closing words about this faction's roster. Overall, I'm a really big fan. Obviously, I was always going to be since it's undead and I love me some of that. Even so, the mix of units from the undead factions alongside new additions really makes it feel like a fresh, new roster that's a lot of fun to build with, especially once you take into account the Tomb King style of recruiting. While it can occasionally be annoying, I always enjoy these sorts of limits as they force you to experiment with more units than just sticking to the exact same templates every time. They're pretty much in a place where the vampire counts need to be. They're still mainly melee focused with a few options in other areas to pad things out. The ranged units are limited but bring some great power and mean you're not forced to march towards enemies every single battle. In typical OVN fashion, the roster also feels very balanced and like they could just be a DLC. All units look and feel authentic to the faction and the area of the map where they live. Nothing is extremely overpowered, and there are some which are a little worse than others outside of their specific niches, but that's just fine. The one thing I would have liked is another generic lord. I know you have 4 legendaries, but having the choice of a caster or melee generic lord just gives you more options instead of picking the same lords every single time. It's a very minor complaint and doesn't take away from the mod being a great addition. If you're an undead fan and you want to play a mix between the Tomb Kings and the vampire counts, then this is the faction for you. And there's everything I have for the battle side of things for the Dread King's Legion. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, as well as any other mods you'd like me to check out. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then why not check out this one on the campaign mechanics of the Dread King's Legions.